So I want to preface this video by saying it's one of the most interesting topics to me, but it's also been one of the hardest to research. It's fascinated me since I was a kid, and it's been months just trying to get to the point where I feel like I can present it. And that is the subject of kings and prophets. These are some of the most defining characters of history, responsible for the rise and fall of kingdoms and the birth of religions. Although we've all heard of these people, seldom do we go into how and why they were able to change the world. What were their experiences? To give an overview, we are specifically looking at the ancient idea of divine kingship, of prophets, dreams, and seizures, and how all this ultimately relates to microorganisms and the holobiont model of humans. So the second part is going to be on seizures and prophets, and the third part is going to be on this old class of kings that we're going to call Shaman-Kings and the Holobiont. But we're going to start on this first part, which is a trope called the Fisher King. The namesake of this motif comes from the Arthurian cycle of mythology, in which a wounded Fisher King guards the Holy Grail. The Fisher King is tied to the health of the land, and his wound is usually in the groin, and so the land itself is barren. If you want a live-action representation of this, watch the 1981 movie Excalibur. Or if you haven't seen the movie, at the very least, watch this clip, You and the Land Are One. Percival is seeking the Holy Grail in order to restore the health of the dying King Arthur. The apparition asks Percival, "Who am I?" Percival replies with, "You are my lord and king, you are Arthur." He then asks, "Have you found the secret that I have lost?" Percival says, "Yes, you and the land are one." Percival receives the Holy Grail and returns to the physical King Arthur and says, "You and the land are one, drink." King Arthur drinks and his life force is restored, and he comes to the realization of his sins. He says, "Lancelot carried my honor, and Guinevere my guilt. Mordred bore my sins, my knights have fought my causes." And he says, "Now, my brother, I shall be king." He rides out with his knights, and the land is starting to blossom and grow again. The Fisher King trope is this ancient idea that the king is tied to the health of the land. His moral responsibilities, his very vitality, is tied to the fertility of the land. You've also seen the Fisher King trope in the movie of Lion King. When Scar takes over, the land goes to waste. This is also in the myth of Oedipus. After his sin, the land is barren for a year. Most famously, you've probably heard this in the Mandate of Heaven of Chinese kings or the divine right to rule in European kings. The heavens or divinities granted these kings power over the land itself. They could change the very force of nature. Indeed, these kings were the heart and soul of the land and people itself. So long as they upheld their moral and dutiful responsibilities as kings, the lands would prosper. Any mistakes they made would ripple to the very land and ecosystem itself. An example of this is in Celtic cultures, in which you have something called the Gisa. They were totemic injunctions or taboos placed on a king that, if followed, would grant benevolence, but if broken, led to ruin or even death. One example is that the fruits of the earth can only be eaten after a king or priest has partaken of them ceremonially. In some cases, they had to be the first to rise in the morning and the last to go to sleep. There were places they had to visit and rituals they had to perform without fail. It was this sort of built-in torture or guilt system that the king had to follow in order to maintain his power, his divinity. This idea that the king and the land are one come from these old fertility cults. The responsibility of the unaccountable was placed on the king, and out of this sense of dependency and frustration, religion was born. Somehow man had to establish communication with the source of the world's fertility, and thereafter maintain a right relationship with it. It followed, therefore, to induce the heavenly phallus to complete its orgasm. Man must stimulate it by sexual means, by singing, dancing, orgiastic displays, and above all, by the performance of the copulatory act itself. The sun was seen as this phallus, and the rain its life-giving fluid. The earth itself was the womb. The language and imagery that these fertility cults used is very explicit, it's very graphic. You'll often hear of fertility cults and how so many of these gods came from fertility deities, but very seldom do they go into the actual imagery and how they viewed things. And at the core of this was the king. He was the link to the spirit world and the physical world. Because of that, the king himself, his virility, his vitality was tied to the fertility of the land. This theme is very obvious in the Egyptian ceremony, in which the king every year would go to the Nile and put his seed into the river in order to guarantee fertility. So what is sacred kingship? It's a religious and political concept by which a ruler is seen as an incarnation, manifestation, mediator, or agent of the sacred or holy. The concept originated in prehistoric times, but it continues to exert a recognizable influence in the modern world. At one time, when religion was totally connected with the whole existence of the individual as well as that of the community, and when kingdoms were in varying degrees connected with religious powers or religious institutions, there could be no kingdom that was not in some sense sacral. The very idea of sacred comes from this idea of the sacral, of the sacrum, the fertility aspect of a human. Again, this is the Fisher King trope, the idea that the fertility of the land is tied to the sacral health of the king. The usual function of a sacred king is to bring blessings to his people and area of control. Because he has a supernatural power over the life and welfare of the tribe, the chief or king is believed to influence the fertility of the soil, cattle, and human beings, but mostly the coming of rain. He has power over the forces of nature. Where rain is vitally necessary for the welfare and continuity of a people, the king can be described primarily in terms of this special function. Protection against evil of all sorts is also important for the welfare of the country. If the tribe or the country is beset by misfortune, epidemics, starvation, bad harvests, or floods, the king can be held responsible. Sometimes the king is believed to have the power to heal sickness by means of touch or contact. This power over the land, of the people, of the fertility, and the forces of nature hinged on their connection to the divine. Only the dreams given to a king were direct messages of the divine. The divine kings, they needed to have mystic experiences, the practice of religious ecstasies, religious experiences during altered states of consciousness, together with whatever ideologies, ethics, rites, myths, legends, and magic may be related to them. Carl Jung summarizes this idea of dreams and kings in a single paragraph. I can illustrate this by my experience with a primitive tribe in East Africa. To my amazement, these tribesmen denied that they had any dreams. But through patient and direct talks with them, I soon found that they had dreams just like everyone else, but they were convinced their dreams had no meaning. Dreams of ordinary men mean nothing, they told me. They thought that only the dreams that mattered were those of chiefs and medicine men. These, which concerned the welfare of the tribe, were highly appreciated. The only drawback was that the chief and the medicine man both claimed that they had ceased having meaningful dreams. They dated this change from the time that the British came to their country. This is obviously a very sad example of that, but to these people, they had lost that authority. It only came from those who were the king. They need these dreams to understand what's going on in their environment, in their lives, and to make sense of these unaccountable phenomena. A broader foundation for the divinity of the king is the view of the king as the son of a god, which can take on different forms. These kings were directly the son of a god, or they were semi-divine or demigods. These are your tropes of god kings, or kings that would be deified. They would be joined in the pantheon after their death. They were the incarnation of supernatural power, the executive agent of a god. As a servant of a god, he carries out the work of the god on earth. And this is not obscure information. This is the academic consensus of many of these ancient societies, civilizations, and tribes. We'll talk about this more in the third part, but this class of kings, they were shaman kings. They were the head of spiritual life and the physical life. And these are found in cultures from the Americas to Africa to Europe to the Middle East and Asia and Australia. Of course, there was unique aspects to these cultural differences, but we're speaking in broad terms. There nevertheless was a continuous theme. The real lord of the city, the country, or the state remains the god, and the king remains in a subservient relationship to him. To reinforce this fertility aspect, the kings often had some sort of shepherd or farming regalia. He provides his people with food, he leads them and protects them from dangers, and at the same time shows his superiority over them. And this is where we'll transition to the second part of prophets. The king is a priest and a seer. Religious duties quite often are connected with the office of chieftain, who is also priest or seer and rainmaker, all in one. The king was a lawmaker and a judge and a warlord and the center of spiritual life. And all of those were related ultimately to the fertility, the prosperity of the land and the people itself. Now we will also talk about how the division of functions evolved, where you would get that archetype of a priest and his court wizard, his sage, his mystic, his astrologer, his occultist. In the second part, we'll talk about that other role, that prophet role, and then finally bring it back to that idea of a shaman-king, where that role was occupied by one single sole person. So this is the Fisher King trope, and part 2 will be on seizures. So now we're on the subject of prophets and seizures. The link between religious and mystical experiences with seizures is not a novel idea. In the 17th century, a French physician wrote a book on greatness and epilepsy. However, this theory runs into some issues, the first being it's hard to diagnose people thousands of years ago. While there are some historical figures with documented cases of epilepsy, it's not as if you could say that about everyone with mystic experiences. Where this theory runs into issues is that it requires epilepsy. However, with recent breakthroughs in the neurology of mystic experiences, it's not actually epilepsy itself. The actual experience is temporal lobe seizures. For clarification, these can be non-epileptic. As a reminder, a seizure is an uncontrolled burst of electrical activity between neurons. Now, the cause and specifics is extremely wide-ranging. It can occur through disease, through parasites, through neurological conditions and photosensitivity. It could be from hallucinogens, from injury, from practiced fasting, trauma. It could be from alcoholism, from sleep deprivation, and perhaps most importantly for this, meditation, hypnotic states, and trance states. So again, it's less so epilepsy and more so just if a seizure hits the temporal lobe. In most cases, epilepsy was a debilitating disease, and often those people were shunned from society. So what kind of seizure are we dealing with? From the beginnings of Western medicine, practitioners have recognized that hypnosis, hysteria, dissociation, sleep, epilepsy, and mystical experience present many common features, and thus are likely to share some common causal mechanisms. Neurologists suspect that many experiences the general public regards as mystical will eventually be linked to simple partial seizures, or auras, of temporal limbic origin. The most common psychic or experiential ictal manifestation of temporal lobe epilepsy are fear, déjà vu, jamais vu, memory, recall, and visual and auditory hallucinations. Also characterized and identified are intellectual auras, dreamy states, or cognitive auras, in which the experience of the immediacy and liveliness of one's own or external reality is altered. For example, the feeling that the external surrounding is just a dream, and also are often associated with a sense of detachment. Double consciousness auras create a simultaneous experience of persisting remnants of one's own normal consciousness and of a new quasi-parasitical consciousness with a different perception of reality. Auras of depersonalization, derealization, and dream state account for approximately 1/4 of psychic auras. The author talks about how these meditative-induced seizures were often ignored because they were kind of culturally sanctioned. This is where the shortcoming in the epilepsy theories of religion and greatness come from, because only considered were the actual disease of epilepsy and not self-induced meditative seizures. The meditation-induced phosphene-mediated seizure most closely resembles the self-induced photosensitive seizures that begin as generalized seizures, but then fail to generalize and instead trigger simple or complex partial seizures of temporal limbic origin. It is this temporal limbic activation that generates the ecstatic symptoms that are so reinforcing. In effect, a meditator's success at inducing the full progression of phosphene images, culminating in the lightning-like flashes and an ecstatic aura, is evidence of an acquired phosphene sensitivity, a meditation-acquired phosphene sensitivity. So what does this all mean? What are we talking about? Well, let's look at some examples. Photosensitive seizures in religious mysticism. The sun dance ritual practiced by a number of Native American tribes in the American West presents a good example of the spiritual use of sun gazing. They take a vow and participate in a dance. They move around a pole while staring at a part of the sun. They do this for several days non-stop, no food and no sleep. Those who have chosen to be pierced have eagle claws or skewers inserted beneath the skin of their chests and then fastened to a rope tied to the central pole. The dance begins again, and they're staring towards the sun while they pull back against the rope until their skin rips apart, releasing them to collapse on the ground in an altered state of consciousness. The combination of physical exhaustion, fasting, severe pain, and sun gazing overloads the physiological systems of the body. After the collapse and the altered state of consciousness, mystical visions often appear. The purpose of these seizures is captured in this idea. A Sioux sun dancer who saw such visions said that he saw colored discs of light in front of his eyes that he used to diagnose the ailments of tribal members who regarded him as having acquired mystical powers. In Renaissance Europe, Jewish rabbis who celebrated the secret disciplines of the mystical Kabbalah recommended the practice of setting a bowl of water with oil spread over its surface at an angle to the sun so that the brilliant sunbeams reflected off the oil and directly into one's eyes. The bright light that flooded the visual field was considered to be only a hint of the true radiance of God's glory. In Protestant Europe during the 16th century, Jacob Boehme, a shoemaker's apprentice, was confirmed in his choice to begin a new career as an itinerant mystic when he happened to look at a pewter dish reflecting beams of sunlight and triggered a photosensitive seizure with ecstatic qualities. So all of this tells us two very important things. It tells us that the ecstatic and mystic experiences are universal. It's something that any human can potentially experience. It also tells us that these are the mystic and divine experiences of the gods or of God. And you use this to obtain spiritual knowledge as a way to diagnose people. It gives you a sensitivity to the unaccountable phenomena. Perhaps in simplest terms, it's easiest to say that there's only one altered state of consciousness. They're all varying degrees and intensities of entoptic vision, which is basically seeing within the visual system, seeing inside of the brain itself. So dreams and dissociation and psychedelics and brain injury and all the neurochemistry going on is going to change the intensity and the exact perception and the exact experience. We could probably summarize it by saying that it's an experience of subconscious or unconscious mechanisms of the brain consciously, which during its most intense state is a temporal limbic seizure. It's all happening within the visual system. It's just about different ways of getting to that state. You might be most familiar with the Hindu mystic idea of the Kundalini. Now again, we're dealing with different cultures that interpret things differently, but at its most intense, that idea of the Kundalini is the temporal limbic seizure. But taking a step back, what are prophets and what do they do? The sort of archetype of a prophet is that they go off into a cave or an isolated area to meditate, to fast for weeks, months, even years. They reach this so-called enlightenment through some form of fasting, of self-injury, of meditation, of psychedelics, whatever it may be. They have an ecstatic seizure. They have visions. They have this newfound and profound sense of purpose, of knowledge, and they write that down. They come out with this divinely inspired scriptures, and then they go off into society and point to people everything that's wrong. They take this sort of diagnostic perspective to an entire culture, both to the health of people and to the way that society is being run. They point out everyone's problems, and they tell them the solution. And they acquire a following through getting results. People are upset about the status quo, let's say, and you give them a model and a solution and a voice to those problems. And often they're able to perform miracles of some sort. They're able to actually diagnose and cure people. Whatever may go down, they ultimately build a following. With all that in mind, let's take a look at the interictal behaviors of seizures. Basically, the behaviors or the side effects of these temporal lobe seizures. Some of the temporal lobe seizure symptoms are hypergraphia, an urge to write that is out of character, compulsive, and can't be explained by the patient's profession. Another one is hyperreligiosity, a dramatic deepening of interest in religious or philosophical issues, and an enhanced sense of personal destiny, and unexplained changes in sexual behavior, which can manifest as a loss of libido, or an increase in libido, which is hypersexuality, or just a shift of some bizarre expression of it. And finally, the symptom of circumstantiality, which refers to a style of writing or talking that gets lost in details. It's something vague and cryptic and poetic. This is the exalted language of holy texts and scriptures. It's why you would have certain prophets having multiple wives, like Joseph Smith and Muhammad. Or in other cases, they'd be detached from all worldly things, like Siddhartha, for example. It was easy to do when that part of your brain was shut off or turned to the max. They had a sense of being chosen by God. They saw these ecstatic visions. They had a whole body experience. They had these hallucinations. They're in this dream state. They had these ecstatic visions. And when I say prophet, I really just mean any of these mystic figures from history. But not just the specific religion-defining mystics, but the likes of Hildegard and Aleister Crowley and John Dee and Edward Kelly and William Blake and various Taoist and Islamic and African and American mystics. This is the same neurological mechanism of shamans, and now we're going to connect it to Shaman-Kings. So now we get to the main point. We get to the Shaman-King. I know the first two parts was a lot of information, and it was kind of building from the ground up a common understanding. I'll put in the description a lot of related videos you can watch that go into those themes more if you still have questions. The king was the chief priest of the land and the superior of all priests and other cult functionaries. In many images, he is portrayed as presiding over the great festivals and bringing offerings to the gods. Later, priests carried out their functions as his representatives. The king, again, was the heart and soul of the land. This was ubiquitous across the entire world, essentially. In Africa, from the earliest times, there was a type of king who was called the Lord of the Earth. He originally combined political and cultic functions. In that case, he retained only the cultic ones. In others, it was just the political. This book is mentioning ancient myths in China in which certain governors and kings handled the affairs of spirits to determine the proper place of spirits, and others would handle the affairs of earth in order to determine the proper place of men. This myth is the most important textual reference to shamanism in ancient China, and it provides the crucial clue to understanding the central role of shamanism in ancient Chinese politics. The ghosts and spirits are wiser than the sages by as much as the sharp-eared and keen-sighted surpass the deaf and blind. Access to that wisdom was, of course, requisite for political authority. In the past, everybody had had that access through the shamans. Since heaven had been severed from earth, only those who controlled that access had the wisdom, hence the authority, to rule. Shamans, therefore, were a crucial part of every state court. In fact, scholars of ancient China agree that the king himself was actually head shaman. To provide a good definition of shamans and shamanism, in ancient China, intermediaries used in the cult of spirits were called wu. They figure in old texts as experts in exorcism, prophecy, fortune-telling, rain-making, and interpretation of dreams. They were also magic healers, and in later times, at any rate, one of their methods of doctoring was to go, as Siberian shamans do, to the underworld and find out how the power of death can be propitiated. The descent of the spirits or the ascent of the shaman or the king was achieved in a manner not altogether clear. Music and dance were apparently part of the ceremony. Alcoholic drinks were possibly involved, as the Shang were notorious drinkers, and many bronze ritual vessels were designed to serve alcoholic beverages. Did the alcohol or other substances bring about a trance during which the shaman engaged in imagined flight? And again, now we understand more of the mechanism of the trance. So this big mystery of shamanism and kings of having these divine ecstatic experiences, we're now able to more confidently speak on that part, which has the ramifications of understanding how they viewed things, what they saw, what they experienced, and neurological and behavioral symptoms associated with that. The shaman's power rests in his ability to throw himself into a trance at will. The drum and dance simultaneously elevate his spirit and conjure to him his familiars, the beasts and birds, invisible to others, that have supplied him with his power and assist him in his flight. And it is while in his trance of rapture that he performs his miraculous deeds. To regard the man as shaman and the beast as his helper is certainly a view consistent with the alter ego motif. New World art also sheds light on the fact that on Chinese bronzes, the beasts depicted with humans are all tiger. In early cultures of the New World, the jaguar was the alter ego for the members of the highest class. In the Shang dynasty, as previously noted, the kings were sometimes called the highest shamans. Very possibly, these man-beast motifs on ancient artifacts of China could represent not only the shaman bridging the worlds, but the king himself or one of his close kinsmen. And we can look at the actual mechanism of trance states and entoptic phenomena that shamans would have employed. These different states, these altered states of consciousness, these different hallucinogens, these different use of light and movement and drums and music and dance would affect how you could see and what you would see. In some cases, as with Amerindian shamanism, they used this to see certain microorganisms that represented a systemic infection. The eye in entoptic visions could see down to a micrometer. Your ability to become a shaman rested on the fact that you could enter these states. Like what we saw with the sun dance, when you can experience these mystical visions, you were able to induce these states more often and so be revealed to this hidden spiritual world. For the king, in order to be associated with that divine connection, they needed to have those same mystic experiences. The king may be the recipient of a direct revelation of the will of a god, Thus, in Egypt, the pharaoh received a divine oracle through dreams in the temple, a practice known as incubation. This is your anointing processes, your coronation, even your baptism. The king would be taken to a special place and given a ecstatic vision. They would be hypnotized or tranced, and in some cultures they were beat near to death. You wanted to give your king a seizure so that he could see and experience the mystic and the divine. Through this brain damage, essentially, through these seizures, the king gained a level of discernment and judgment and power over the land itself. Of course, the longer they lived, the madder they may become as that brain damage accumulates, and so you have this archetype of the mad king. After that sort of initiation ritual, they would become someone else, a god. The king receives a new name, their throne name. In Iran, for example, the king is proclaimed by his royal name as world ruler. Immediately upon the proclamation of the new status of the king and his royal name, the subject people generally evoke a jubilant shout such as "Long live the king." An African variety of a response to the proclamation is, "He is our corn and our shield." And now that we know more of the temporal limbic seizures, we know of the hypersexuality, the hyperreligiosity, the hypographia, the sense of destiny. It's why so many of these kings would take many wives or concubines. This goes back to the idea of the Fisher kings, of this tie to fertility. You had to awaken their libido in a sense. And temporal limbic seizures was a consistent way to do that, to accomplish that. Again, some of that being near-death experiences. It often includes references to moving through a dark tunnel toward a bright light. It bears resemblance to a phosphene seizure experience mentioned in a previous chapter. These striking parallels in visual imagery suggest the hypothesis that, as a result of traumatic injuries, these victims experience a sudden onset of hypersynchronous spike wave complexes, and that it is on the onset of this hypersynchronous seizure that generates the subliminal image of moving through a dark tunnel. In these cases, perhaps they may be sufficient to drive the rapid emergence of a hippocampal seizure that generates the bright light. I mentioned in the last video that epilepsy shouldn't be necessarily the focal point, yet now we run into certain cases of whole generations of kings that had diagnosed epilepsy, such as these 18th dynasty pharaohs, whose conditions support the theory that these pharaohs may have suffered from a familial temporal epilepsy syndrome that ultimately led to their early downfall. They conditioned and bred and tried to induce this as much as possible, with many times it backfiring. I imagine for every great character in history that had temporal lobe seizures, probably had hundreds that just went mad and died and suffered terribly from those conditions. It's been proposed that the likes of Caesar and Hannibal Barca and Napoleon Bonaparte and Roosevelt and Alexander the Great all suffered from seizures of some variety. Even people like Aristotle and Plato were thought to have some kind of seizure or epileptic condition. Genghis Khan was probably the last figure in history that would be, in sort of a scholarly debate, labeled a Shaman-King. Why did so many cultures try to do this? Why was this a requisite for being a king or being a shaman? It comes down to the idea of what is the unconscious, what are dreams? These seizures turn what would normally only be kind of glimpsed at during dreams into waking consciousness. The best way I can describe it is a sort of synesthesia of conscious perception, where you're getting these subconscious, subliminal messages from the body and the environment into waking consciousness. So far as we know, microorganisms communicate with us in three methods: through the endocrine system, through the nervous system, and through the immune system. The microbiome is in constant communication with the body and the brain. All of those systems I mentioned, they have effects on your personality, your perceptions, on your experience of life and consciousness itself. The Holobiont model considers the host genome, the hologenome of the microbiome, and the environmental metagenome. We aren't some closed-off system moving through nature. We are an ecological unit. What we call the spirits are the microorganisms and the environmental metagenome. The shamanic state brings to awareness these dreams in waking consciousness, these subconscious subliminal messages from the microbiome, which is part of the greater environment. That shamanic awakening allows one to communicate back to the very environment. In shamanism is this idea of the masters of game, that microorganisms play a background role in nature. The king is the king of game. He commands the forces of nature, the microorganisms.